Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. This is Muncie Public Library's Big Questions, Big Ideas seminar that we hold in conjunction with Ball State's Philosophy and Religious Studies Department. How's everybody doing today? Today, we are listening to a seminar by Dr. Kimberly and Harris, and this will be discussing what good philosophers do. Dr. Harris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Joe. So just a little bit of background on this paper. It is a chapter from my book that I'm writing at the moment, which is about Du Bois's meta-philosophy. So it's about obviously what philosophers do and then what I think good philosophers do. And I'm sort of drawing from Du Bois's ideas here. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation at the end. This is a very controversial topic. I imagine that most philosophers have opinions about what it is they do, and I guess I just have strong opinions about what I think they should be doing. Okay, so Du Bois is not recognized for expressing a view about the role of the philosopher, and the lack of the recognition is due to the accepted view that he simply eschews philosophy, deciding it is just abstract and useless. But he did not dismiss philosophy, but rather used it to propose a theory of democracy that was focused on reflecting the will of the people. This theory uniquely relied on the philosopher for identifying and interpreting the dynamic social laws that direct the daily lives of people. He gives the philosopher what I call a prophetic role, tasked to foretell events using hermeneutics with a cooperative attitude. And this is essential to democratic deliberation. Important is the idea that this role works in tandem with the scientists tasked with generating public trust in science and maintaining the accessibility of knowledge, the historian tasked with scrupulously and rigorously recording the truth, and the artist tasked with expanding the public capacity for judgment through the communication of beauty. Only together can they truly support the transformation of society, positive transformation of society. So, following Du Bois, I will argue that good philosophers occupy a prophetic role, and in what follows, I'll outline what precisely this means and show why understanding this aspect of his meta-philosophy is essential for contemporary philosophers to understand for their inquiries. Today, more than ever, philosophy has come under attack. It is primarily its value that is in question. So to ask the question about the value of philosophy is like asking, right, what is the use of understanding? An infamous answer is that understanding has intrinsic value. We value it for its own sake. Aristotle's metaphysics begins by providing this view, and this is a famous line. It's probably one of my favorite lines in philosophy, the history of philosophy. But he says, all human beings by nature desire to know. So if nothing else, we are curious beings in that we like to know what's going on and we want to know why. After we have attended to our basic needs, such as feeding and sheltering ourselves, we are inclined to ask deeper questions. Does God exist? How should I live my life? What is justice? We raise our heads and we look around and we try to understand not only the things around us, but ourselves. Joseph Piper would talk about the intrinsic value of philosophy in the 20th century this way, quote, to philosophize is to act in such a way that one steps out of the workaday world. The philosophical act is incommensurable with the world of supply and demand. So he thinks it should be done for its own sake. Because of this, it can never serve as a means to some other end. Du Bois will offer us a different view. Philosophy is instrumentally good, and as such has extrinsic value. We value it for its utility in improving our lives. Despite the historical link between science and philosophy, Present-day scientists often perceive philosophy as completely different from or even antagonistic to science. It is the genesis of both science and philosophy, with science taking the empirical road to understanding and philosophy the conceptual road. Philosophy's contribution to science takes at least 4 forms. It helps to clarify scientific concepts. It gives a critical assessment of the scientific method. It formulates new concepts and theories. And finally, it fosters a dialogue between the sciences and as well between science and society. And that, of course, is going to be important for Du Bois. Philosophy, too, is about a priori knowledge. Science is about contingent facts. Philosophy is about necessary truths. Science is about descriptive facts. Philosophy is about normative truths. Science needs philosophy, and as Du Bois will insist, philosophers need scientists to effectively do their jobs. Science and philosophy are complementary enterprises, and they have always been important connections between them, which continue despite the growth of institutional science and its increasing splintering into more and more highly specialized subdisciplines. Academic philosophy, too, has become highly specialized. Although philosophy is perhaps the most self-reflective discipline, or at least among them, there's still a lot to be said about the doing of philosophy. What do philosophers do better? What do good philosophers do? Answering these 2 questions, at least personally for me, has been driven by teaching Introduction to Philosophy to freshmen. And here at Marquette, students are required to take an introductory class to philosophy. And so naturally, a worry emerges about the usefulness of philosophy for the students, especially when they have this sense in their minds, which they express pretty readily on the first day of class, that philosophy is just a bunch of dead white guys in their armchairs theorizing. And so that perception colors our initial conversations about what philosophy is. Now, for good reason, I think philosophy has come under attack. And I think it goes beyond the anti-intellectualism that characterizes American political culture, or even the general tendency at the moment to defund the humanities. The hostility towards and mistrust of intellectuals is routinely expressed in the deprecation of philosophy. Further, the dismissal of art, literature, and science as impractical, politically motivated, and even contemptible human pursuits has also been expressed in the deprecation of philosophy. The real reason the humanities are under attack in general is their perceived impracticality. Even among Harvard students, the search for practicality in a degree obscures the search for skills that will equip students for the rest of their personal and professional lives. On the contrary, I think practitioners of philosophy play a role here too. They do not spend enough time considering how to go about fulfilling their roles, despite being rather reflective about the metaphilosophical question concerning the nature of philosophy. So I like to think of this as a good example. If you were to go see an oral surgeon, I've been having a lot of oral surgery visits lately, and moments before the surgeon is going to make his first incision, if he shared with you that he had not given much thought to how he was going to approach your surgery, you would be terrified. You would be totally terrified, especially if he has you in that, that thing that holds your mouth open, so you can't even about why it is I think doing philosophy in the dark is so dangerous. Much in the same way, I think there's a danger to not thinking about the process of philosophizing. Du Bois thought about this, and he has a complex relationship to and history with the study of philosophy. Du Bois remarked that while he had learned a lot from his philosophy professors, he thought academic philosophy was lovely but sterile. This, however, is contrary to the young Du Bois that was fascinated by philosophy. The contradiction here is merely superficial. What he did in fact struggle with was what he took to be a desolate manner of thinking practiced by philosophers of his day. As the tale goes, he had turned away from philosophy for more fruitful intellectual pursuits in history and sociology. But this is not altogether true, as I was saying. For him, philosophy ought to be useful in that it urges positive social change. His interest was dedicated to a kind of thinking that can only be described as aphoretic thinking, and it is above all in the working out of its method that Kwame Anthony Appiah first saw Du Bois's great achievement toward which he oriented himself. Du Bois's interest in philosophy began to stir after he took a philosophy course at Fisk University, in which both, quote, religious dogma and inexcusable contradictions of logic were inappropriately interjected. His path led him to Harvard University to continue his studies. Harvard did not recognize his bachelor's degree from Fisk, and this resulted in him getting another bachelor's degree. And it hadn't been recognized because Fisk is a historically Black university. So whenever you're complaining about how long it's going to take you to finish your bachelor's degree, just remember that Du Bois got 2 of them because he was so committed to thought. So he explains his philosophical path in a letter. After reading History and Reality, he wrote to Herbert Apteker, the historian, who would become one of his closest intellectual friends. And he was talking about his book, and the first chapter of the book stood out to Du Bois because it addressed the foundational problem that he was interested in answering, and that is, what is truth? He claims his goal was to discover truth, and he capitalizes truth there. Philosophy for him is primarily concerned, at least the content of philosophy, with truth. Of course, truth is one of the central subjects in philosophy, yet it is also one of its largest. A large variety of issues in philosophy and outside of philosophy relate to truth, either by relying on or implying theses about truth. Much like Socrates, Du Bois had an aversion to dogma, that is, a point of view put forth as authoritative without adequate grounds, had no place for Du Bois in philosophical discourse. There are, of course, many theories of truth, but given that he was praising Apteker's book at the time, which was on historical consciousness and the appearance of reality, we might, I think, loosely associate Du Bois with correspondence and pragmatic theories of truth. Truth is not merely a property of being in accord with reality for him, but also a goal for which philosophers should strive. While truth is the opposite of falsity, it also corresponds to thought for him, a kind of way of thinking and orientation to thinking. In the same letter, he indicates 2 important things for our purposes here in thinking about the role of philosophers. That is, against this view that Du Bois eschews philosophy, he shows us in this letter that his education in philosophy was significant to him. And 2, his view about the content of philosophy, primarily being about truth, is also really important. He would continue to be interested in philosophy, but he would abandon the search for an absolute truth. And he would do that after he comes back from Berlin. He spends 2 years in Berlin during his doctoral studies. To understand the role Du Bois gives to the philosopher, I think we have to attend to his philosophy of history. And I argue, although I won't spend so much time arguing for it here, that he is a historicist. And he explains to Apteker in that same letter the course that studying philosophy put on him. He says to Herbert, quote, "For 2 years, I studied under William James while he was developing pragmatism, under Santayana and his attractive mysticism, and under Josiah Royce and his Hegelian idealism. I then found and adopted a philosophy that has served me since. Thereafter, I turned to the study of history and what has become sociology." So his study of history displays, I think, a deep philosophical commitment transversing his works. A lot of philosophers who commentate on Du Bois's work point out that he helped establish the subfield philosophy and race, or philosophy of race, that he has given us major contributions to social and political philosophy and philosophy of the social sciences, and most recently, aesthetics. His views on history, I think, undergird his approach to what he first famously called the Negro problem and what he would later refer to as the race problem. And it's something like what we will refer to today as racism, even though I don't think it can be reduced to racism. He conceptualizes the race problem as an object of social scientific inquiry, and as such, understanding its evolution is a matter of historical observation. He argues that an appropriate politics for the American context must counteract racism and Jim Crow. This political expressivism relies on accounting for the epochs that shape the context, and I'm quoting Robert Gooding Williams there. The artist uses historical reason to both locate and individuate themselves. Du Bois provocatively argues that all art is propaganda and claims that the artist has a special place in, quote, wider webs of meaning concerning the true and the just, and must create themselves as individuals by working out their orientation to these networks. And I am quoting Paul C. Taylor there. But on the whole, his historicism, Du Bois's historicism, comprehends human nature, or the human condition, morality, and reason, not as absolute, but changing and shaped by historical context. So now I want to talk about what I take to be a type of historicism that Du Bois is committed to, which is methodological historicism. The goal of methodological historicism is to legitimate history as a science. And this is a very old conversation, but methodological historicism pursues the possibility of obtaining objective knowledge from historical analysis. The project to distinguish the methods of the human sciences from those of the natural sciences was a central conversation in 19th century German philosophy. And it's also a central and pivotal conversation for understanding Du Bois's view of science. Due to the maturity of the natural sciences, they are thought to have the model the human sciences ought to use. And this is the positivistic model. Du Bois actually criticizes Comte's proposal of a method of historical analysis that eschews narrative form like biography, which of course would be very important for Du Bois. With his positivism, Comte was hesitant of the real elements of society and a method for explaining them. Du Bois also criticizes the positivism of Herbert Spencer for its verbal jugglery, which led to enigmatic abstractions, but has no relation to empirical facts. In total, there are 4 standpoints that emerge about the proper method for the human sciences. The first was the positivistic model I just mentioned, and the last 3, which I won't talk about all in detail, are anti-positivistic in their outlook, meaning that they thought that the human sciences needed their own method, own unique method. The last of those 3 is the view that the human sciences depend on hermeneutics, which comes out of Wilhelm Dilthey's work. And the aim there is to understand lived experience through historical consciousness. I associate Du Bois with Dilthey's view. Du Bois justifies the humanistic sciences, the sciences distinguished by their focus on lived experience, by their ability to more readily solve social problems and promote social progress or positive social transformation. He thought a hermeneutic method could lay on a secure epistemological foundation for research. He thinks that history has the potential to be a science. And in this, he describes the process to legitimize history as a science this way. And I'm quoting him from Black Reconstruction. He says, if history is going to be scientific, if the record of human action is going to be set down with the accuracy and faithfulness of detail, which will allow its use as a measuring rod and guidepost for the future of nations, there must be some standards of ethics in research and interpretation. History is a science when the historian follows a code of ethics and relies at least on a systematic and identifiable hermeneutic method. So when she is scrupulous, rigorous, and adheres to a method of interpretation, she is acting as a scientist. History is unscientific, of course, when it is incorrectly and tersely recorded, follows no code of ethics, and has no identifiable hermeneutic method, meaning that the historian either has bad intentions in recording history or is decided in misrecording history. This is all unscientific for Du Bois. Since Du Bois is an empiricist, he holds that knowledge originates in experience. So explaining social phenomena in empirical terms is to explain them in historical terms. And so to a degree, he thinks that laws of history can be determined if we want to call them laws. However, they're not absolute. They're not absolute in the way we think of the scientific laws of the natural sciences, right? Gravity, for example. Humans, we are creatures of changing law because we have free will. And free will takes the record of human action away from strict scientific law. History as the record of human action and sociology as the study of human action are inextricably linked. His insistence on the use of history to bring American social and political systems closer to the people's idea means that historians have a key role in societal progress when motivated to tell the truth and make it publicly available, which of course ratifies history as a science. And recall that the philosopher, when acting in a prophetic role, is seeking to discover the truth. Implicit in the argument to legitimize history as a science, methodological historicists assign history autonomy. History is a science of its own, as we've been seeing. The historical sciences enjoy sovereignty in the realm of historical facts. Since history is irreducible to nature, knowledge of nature is insufficient for historical knowledge. Historical knowledge is derived not from nature, but from society. History is an autonomous mode of knowledge production. Everything that happens in history is explicable according to the methods of human science, not the methods of natural science. Since historical knowledge governs our understanding of the world, it also assigns a primacy to the historical world over the natural world for explaining social historical phenomena. And of course, those explanations are going to be essential if our concern is about positive social transformation. Therefore, attempts to explain social historical events solely using non-historical methods go against historicist impulses. As an empirical method for acquiring knowledge, the scientific method alone cannot provide knowledge of the historical world. Du Bois, and this is a great example of how he assigns history autonomy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the conservation of races, mostly because it's my favorite thing to read. At this point, I feel like I'm only writing about the conservation of races because I think it's a fabulous piece of writing. It was written in 1897, or I should say it was delivered as an address to the American Negro Academy. And what I want to point out about the address is he uses the term history over 20 times in this short address. So it clearly has this importance for him. But in his explaining the autonomy of history in that address, right before he gives this really famous definition of race, which I'm not going to talk about, he gives us this interesting line. He says, "We find upon the world stage today 8 distinctively differentiated races in the sense in which history, which is capitalized, tells us the word must be used." So since race happens in history, or it manifests itself in history, so to speak, he indicates that history is key for understanding how humans have come to be categorized in race groups. Then race is explicable according to historical methods. The attempts to explain race using the methods of natural science fail to capture the meaning of race. But it is even more clear that he affirms the autonomy of the historical world when he claims, quote, "So far as purely physical characteristics are concerned, the differences between men do not explain all the differences of their history." So race is irreducible to physical characteristics. The differences of the histories of race groups are the varying roles they have played in human progress. Therefore, the history of the world is the history of the development of race groups ascending the world stage. His belief in the autonomy of history is why he says that only the historian and the sociologist can recognize race. They're the only experts that have an eye for it. And I want to stop here to say something about what's going on here when he assigns history autonomy, because I think there's a bigger claim to be made when he takes on this project in the conservation of races. But he's concerned about defining race or talking about race or showing why it's so important for human progress, because he wants to show its relevance for human philosophy in general. So I think for contemporary philosophers, we always associate the question or the inquiry about what race is, if it's real or not real, as a narrow question that is only to be answered by philosophers of race or other people interested in identity questions. But that is wrong, because Du Bois has shown us, right, insofar as philosophers, good philosophers, have a historical consciousness, then they would all be concerned with race. And of course, given that philosophers should be concerned with social transformation, then they would be concerned with racism. So the explicit denunciation of racism is a mark of good philosophers. I want to move on now to talk about his argument to legitimate history as a science. So methodological historicists historicize the human world. To be clear, this is not to be conflated with the metaphysical historicism, which attempts to historicize everything in the human world as to provide a complete interpretation of the human world. Everything in the human world is part of history. And this principle seems rather obvious in some ways, but it's in the details that indicate how historicists give it special meaning. First, they deny that human values and institutions are unchanging. And of course, that's going to be important because social transformation is the goal of the philosopher, the good philosopher. All human values and institutions are byproducts of historical development. This opposes the naturalistic tendency to immortalize certain values and institutions for humanity in general for all of time. This is why philosophers, as Du Bois was pointing out, in the quest and the discovery of truth, can't have this quest for absolute truth, because things are changing, our institutions are changing, our values are changing, we're changing. It is important to note that change does not necessarily mean progress. This has to be a specific goal of a philosopher acting in a prophetic role. And then second, the historicist maintains that everything in the human world must be understood in light of its conditions. All human values and institutions are byproducts of their historical context, and as such must be represented in that context. So to put it another way, historicists contextualize. Du Bois embraces science in the fight against racism, but science has two goals. One is mediate, to seek to discover the truth, and two is mediate, to promote social reform. Since fighting scientific racism was one of his initial concerns, particularly in the conservation of races, he's critical of naturalistic conceptions of race. And I don't want to suggest that physiological or phenotypic conceptions of race as scientific conceptions are the only ones he was concerned with. He was also concerned with natural law conceptions of race, cultural conceptions of race, any kind of conception of race that attempted to make one particular dimension of race the thing that makes race race. He had this very dynamic and dialectical way of thinking about race. And so that's what I'm trying to point out there. He proposes a historical conception of race that he thought would better capture human alterity. So the distinction between nature and spirit, and this is going to sound very Hegelian because it is important given that he places race on the side of spirit and he refers to race spirit. He does not, however, argue that there is no natural element of race. For example, he praises Charles Darwin, not just because he put the debate between monogenicism and polygenicism to rest, but he also demonstrates that there is more phenotypic diversity within a group, a race group, than between the groups themselves. So following Immanuel Kant, the scientific conceptions of race, such as Blumenbach, Huxley, and Retzel, justified the inferiority of Black people as to suggest that it was a fact of nature. Of course, this appeal to natural inferiority has directly and indirectly justified the enslavement of Black people through a number of canonical philosophers. However, Du Bois insists on embracing, albeit critically, a careful, systematic, and empirical view of science, which is provided by a hermeneutic approach to history aimed at revising historical records. He demonstrates the need for the humanistic sciences to capture the real meaning of race, as they are better suited at observing social problems such as racism. There are two more defining principles of historicism that are important for not just understanding Du Bois's historicism, but understanding this relationship between the philosopher and the historian as a scientist. And the first is the principle of individuality. This principle signifies that events, epochs, actions, and personalities ought to be considered in their particularity and for their own sake. This principle takes many forms in the historicist tradition. For Hegel, the mind applies its concepts to the world, which is revealed to For Hegel, the mind applies its concepts to the world, which is revealed only to be partially true, that is, within a certain context. Through a dialectical process, the mind revises these incomplete concepts as to reflect a fuller reality. The individual transcends their particularity when they recognize they are part of a whole, that is a family, a social context, or polis, Du Bois claims that individuals as singular persons are not the subject of history. And this is to say that history has a greater meaning than the action and lives of just individual personalities, which is not to suggest their actions don't matter, right? Because sociology is concerned with human action. But Du Bois's use of autobiography, I think, is a great example of what he's intending to do here, which was he did not intend to just narrate his life for the sake of self-indulgence. But as he says, he wants to tell his story, an autobiography of a race concept, because his life is part of a race problem. This is also true of Frederick Douglass, right? Slave narratives are important for this reason. So instead, race groups, come to rise above their viewpoint and comprehend that they are part of human brotherhood, and comprehending them is essential to understanding how to move forward. The second is a principle of holism, and this denies the reducibility of the whole to its parts. The whole is prior to its parts and irreducible to them. On the one hand, Du Bois denies methodological individualism. I was just pointing out the notion that the individual action explains socio-historical phenomena. And on the other hand, he opposed the idea that individuals only make sense, so to speak, within their social context. While society is somewhat cohesive in terms of social laws, and remember I was saying they're not absolute social laws, he's not a methodological holist in the Hegelian sense, because he really does leave this spontaneity and ambiguity open. And he views Hegel to be deterministic in some way. In sociology, hesitant when he was criticizing Comte's holism, because Comte attempted to build a science of society, a sociology, not of human action, but society as a whole. This, Du Bois claims, is an abstraction. And recall that one of his biggest concerns with philosophers is abstraction. In The Conservation of Races, he explained that the history of the world, as I was quoting earlier, is the history of race groups. So historical explanation of society requires an account of the various actions groups have taken toward human progress. And again, right, the philosopher acting in a prophetic role in developing a historical consciousness is going to need account of that. He upholds that the human is a creature of changing law and transformation. So in covering Du Bois's commitment to the main historicist commitments, at least methodological historicist commitments, it's two related principles, history, the autonomy of history, and the historicizing of the human world, and the principles of individuality and holism. I really hope to have shown that there's a deep relationship between philosophy and history, the doing of history. Though I will make a quick note about Du Bois's own historical method. He is a historical revisionist. So he insists that the real stories, for example, of Black people, and this goes back to why autobiography is so important for him, be told by Black people. So the statement that he makes in Black Reconstruction on the role Black people have in the American Civil War and the Reconstruction periods is important, because so much misinformation was recorded by, well, we should think of recording in quotations here, by historians that were unethical. So he decries the scholarly manifestation of racism is in historiography concerning the Civil War and the post-Reconstruction war periods. And he advocates for revision in historical analysis. And later on in his life, in Black Folk Then and Now, Du Bois gives himself the mandate to correct the omissions, misinterpretations, and deliberate actions of Black people. As such, his historical method is captured in the process of revising the writings of histories to overturn the common view held that Black people had not positively contributed to history. Historical revisionism is the means by which the historical record, the history of a society, integrates new facts and interpretations of the events that are commonly understood as history. So revision in historical analysis necessarily involves a change in historical interpretation. And that is the role of a philosopher, if you recall what I said in the beginning. All historians underneath this view, and this might be controversial to historians, but I believe this, are revisionists in some sense. Because knowledge of historical facts is never perfect, it's never complete. Therefore, if the historian is doing her job and acting as a scientist, the result will be a revision to history for Du Bois. And that is an ongoing process. And this is why he's against this absolute hunt for truth for the philosopher. So then interpretation is an integral aspect of historical method. Dilthey, as I was saying before, Du Bois's a view of the method that the humanistic sciences should adopt, hermeneutic method, comes from Dilthey. And Dilthey has this very interesting view. He proposes a critique of historical reason. So this idea that we ought to know that laws that govern the world, which he called a critique of historical reason, he historicizes culture there. All human activity, especially in the cultural realm, must be historicized and, of course, contextualized. So Dilthey promotes a subject that is conscious of the spirit of her time, a historical starting point, so to speak, and a cultural perspective that does not assume anything based off of their subject position or any kind of assumptions or biases. This connection is essential for understanding Du Bois's revisionist historical method, but also it's essential for understanding that methodology, right? The import of historical consciousness. So I'll stop here to say what I think of the broader message is about what good philosophers do with respect to historical consciousness. Good philosophers cannot be ahistorical in their inquiries. That is the concrete kind of message that comes out of this revisionism that Du Bois wants to talk about in history, and also just continuing to connect the relationship that the philosopher has to the historian. The other thing to say quickly about Dilthey, why Du Bois is so interested actually in Dilthey's work, is that Dilthey is actually the one that puts biography and autobiography on a pedestal. And this would have happened while he took a summer course on the philosophy of history. Sorry, not the philosophy of history, the history of philosophy while he was in Berlin, and it was taught by Dilthey. So I want to move on to quoting exactly where Du Bois talks about the role of the philosopher. And this comes in Black Reconstruction. And he says, in the first place, somebody in each era must make clear the facts with utter disregard to his own wish and desire and belief. What we have got to know, so far as possible, are the things that actually happened in the world. Then, with that much clear and open to every reader, the philosopher and prophet has a chance to interpret these facts, but the historian has no right, posing as a scientist, to conceal or distort facts. And until we distinguish between these two functions of the chronicler of human action, we are going to render it easy for a muddled world out of sheer ignorance to make the same mistake 10 times over. Or another way of saying that is to make no social progress. So going back to what I was saying, that he has this view that science has two goals, right? One is immediate, to seek to discover the truth, and that's where the philosopher comes in. And the second one was mediate, to promote social reform. In the study of Negro problems, he primarily describes science in terms of these aims, but the immediate aim of science involves the motivations of the scientist or the historian, which we spent most of our time talking about. But for the philosopher, in attempting to project, right, to make moral decisions about the future, the philosopher requires a reliable body of truth, and that is for democratic purposes. The immediate aims indicate that Du Bois thinks that social, ethical, and political values are essentially the extrinsic value of philosophy. And he articulates that a scientist is tasked with giving us that reliable body of truth. I want to talk briefly, because I didn't get much chance to talk about the artist's role, and maybe we can talk about that in our discussion. But I had said that the artist is tasked with the communication of beauty to the public. The artist too is going to need a reliable body of truth. But Du Bois has a specific kind of aesthetic ideal which manifests itself around an ethical duty that he takes artists to have. And that again is also contingent upon good historical analysis and historical consciousness. The artist has to be sort of aware of her moment of history, the ideas that she is to be communicating. Right? Du Bois thinks that all art is propaganda, and so in some ways it's always communicating a message and has the intention to influence. But the influence, the focus of that influence, as I've been saying all along, is positive social transformation. So I'll just go to conclude here now. By giving the philosopher a prophetic role, I think Du Bois has also given us some concrete directives to think about what it is that good philosophers do. So I'm going to list them, and they've come up at various times throughout my talk today. A good philosopher seeks to discover the truth. A good philosopher explicitly denounces racism. A good philosopher has a well-developed historical consciousness. A good philosopher speaks to the modern condition. A good philosopher works well with the scientist, the historian, and the artist. Deliberative democracy is a form of democracy in which deliberation is central to decision making. And I had said at the very beginning of this talk that the philosopher is sort of the compass for moral decision making. And so the way this plays out, at least in the political sphere, right, is that in adopting or taking up, I should say, the prophetic role, the aim would be to positively contribute to deliberative democracy, the democratic process, right? To make sure that scientists are being ethical, that historians are telling the truth, that artists are sending the correct messages or giving the correct messages to the public. So when we think about all those things together, philosophers, we can make a bigger claim to our essentiality in the world, not just in the world, but in the university, and why a philosophical education is so essential. Had we focused, or if we focus more on these directives that Du Bois gives us. As a young thinker, Du Bois internalized an understanding of democracy as a form of government based on the open exchange of ideas and consent by the governed. So key to this was the importance of a developed education and a self-conscious citizenry. American democracy is historically fragile. He understood how during moments of great social, political, and economic stress, democracy could expand as well as retract based on the color line of racism and the endurance of racism. Throughout the history of democracy in the United States, opportunity and repression have gone hand in hand. Along with the attack on philosophy and American democracy in perpetual peril, Du Bois reminds us of the long fight to protect both and the essential role of a good philosopher in it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for that very moving discussion of Du Bois. You pulled so many threads together. I have about 422 questions myself. However, I do want to concede to our colleagues, Jeff Fry, Myron Jackson, to my students, Yesenia is still on here. So if you guys have a question, please raise your hand since I can see you, or use the raise hand reaction, or if you don't wish to read it aloud yourself, feel free to type it into the chat. And I will read it for you. Just to give you guys a minute to, oh, Myron, you go ahead. Go for it, Myron.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. And I'm looking forward to your book, it sounds like, which is a fascinating, like Kevin said wonderfully, you weave so many things together. I was very impressed by the scholarship. I would love to read the other chapters of your book, because in all honesty, I would love to critique some of the things that you had said in a good way. Like Whitehead says, with bold humility. So one of the things about your talk, before I get into a couple of the points that I wrote down, is that you made me want to go get my Schelling reader and my Schelling books, because I think that possibly Du Bois may have read more Hegel than Schelling, which is, I think, understandable based on the research that you have done. And you would probably know more about it than me, because I haven't looked into it. But I've told this to Appia as well, in terms of, so the first thing that I wanted to emphasize, I just have two main points, and then I wanted to leave you with a question. And the first one is that I take philosophers to be those who critique abstractions, or they criticize abstractions. And so I thought at the beginning, of course, it was a little strong to emphasize a priori or necessary truths. To me, following in the mode of the Romantic age, or the Romantic pathos, which Hegelians seem to be somewhat, they pretend, I think, to be a little allergic to, even though I think Hegel was somewhat of a romantic himself. But we all know the critique of the Romantics, that really the interesting is higher than the true. That's what Whitehead said in Process and Reality, Adventures of Ideas, and in Science in the Modern World, that beauty is higher than truth. I'd love to get your thoughts on what you think about, isn't Black beautiful? Isn't it true that the aesthetic is, the racial deals more in the aesthetic realm, I believe, than in the historical realm? And I think that the historical realm is, let me put it in your words, or at least let me put it in the words that I interpret you as saying, that for good philosophers, they may need to recognize that historians are bad revisionists, or at least compromise revisionists, because like you said, you believe they're all revisionists, but clearly you felt some pushback from historians, because they don't think of themselves as revisionists. They actually think of themselves as more of being the recorders of history, or being, having this objectivity, this kind of tane, or this kind of philosophy of this historiography that doesn't get to the level of Dilthey, I would add. I really loved your stuff on Dilthey because he does bring in autobiography and biography, and that makes it so much richer. His notion of understanding is so much richer. And I think that Du Bois really benefited from taking that class and learning from Dilthey, obviously. So I wanted to emphasize that I think that the aesthetic, which is hard for an Hegelian because the aesthetic is the first realm. You emphasize religion and prophecy, which is the second realm, and you the apex philosophy. But I wanted to see what you had to say about the aesthetic. You brought a little bit of it in at the end, and I'm sure maybe it's in your other 5 chapters. But I just wanted to see what you thought about Hegel's idea that the aesthetic is really just this externalized notion of truth, and really beauty is a degradation of this truth, which you emphasized is not absolute. It's not meant to be static. It's not meant to be non-pluralistic. You emphasize all those things wonderfully, but beauty to me seems, the aesthetic to me seems to be a guide of truth and history, because I think a lot of people in history go with truth and then they realize that what was thrown in the trash can, because people didn't believe in it in terms of the aesthetic imagination, they didn't believe it in terms of the experiments and experience, ends up being the marker of history in so many ways. The mistakes, Whitehead calls this, history is a history of mistakes. That's what Whitehead calls it. He says civilization is a history of mistakes, where so many mistakes become history. But if you go by the category of truth, those things don't really add up to the progress of history. And I'm not just talking about Starbucks, where somebody burnt some coffee and that became Starbucks. I'm really talking about real mistakes in history. So anyway, I got a couple other points, but I'm going to leave it at that because I know some people got to get to some other stuff. But thank you so much, Kimberly. I really enjoyed it, and it's a lot to chew on.
It is. Well, I won't be able to get to all of your points because some of them I really do have to think about. One of the things that I'm still developing, as you probably noticed, is precisely how I want to think about the artist. And I do think there is something to what you say about the aesthetic being kind of the leading ideal here, particularly for Du Bois. And I think one of the things that Taylor really makes apparent in his book, Black is Beautiful, is that, the aesthetic idea is the political idea. And yeah, so I would say that. The other thing about the Hegel connection to Du Bois, and actually one of my students from my Du Bois seminar, I was just reading his seminar paper, but he wrote on aesthetics, and he wrote on this relationship between Du Bois and Hegel, and Du Bois, Hegel, and Kant, I should say. And he really tried to show what Du Bois does uniquely with the artist. Even though in some ways he's inspired and his aesthetics sometimes sounds Hegelian, it sometimes sounds Kantian, what he uniquely situates is why the Black artist is particularly so important. And partly that goes back to what I was saying about historical consciousness and why Dilthey means so much to Du Bois, and why hermeneutics is essential. But, and I'm just thinking about this as you were talking, that in some ways it seems to me to be the case that the artist ends up having to do so much more work in comparison to even the philosopher, the scientist, or the historian. So it's a never-ending job.
If I could just add real quick, the artist digs deep into themselves. This is according to Kassir, which, by the way, he wrote his dissertation under Dilthey. So it's a small world. But anyway, the artist digs deep into themselves, whereas the scientist and the philosopher, in critiquing abstractions and in measuring and observing the external world, actually get to free themselves from themselves.
Oh,
They don't have that burden. Yeah. Artists are burdened.
So I love this line of questioning, Kimberly. I'm just gonna try to pull you in a different direction and talk about where we are in the world right now. I love that how you set the whole chapter up by talking about philosophy being under attack, the humanities being under attack, and pointing to the current set of crises that we're in. In my view, and especially as a white scholar, I can look around at a world in crisis now, and think, not only are we in a world in crisis, but everybody admits that we're in a world in crisis in these various ways. And it's really thinkers like Du Bois who always saw the crisis in the world that we have to look back at. I can't look to Hegel for direction in this. I can look to Du Bois. So I think about all these threads that you tie together: the educational, the historical, the political, the democratic, and the scientific. And we see it's like right now we're in a world, I mean, we're interrupted by COVID, right? So we have a health crisis. Everybody knows that the health crisis has come along with an epistemological crisis that pertains to the sciences. What is the trust in the sciences? What is the honesty of the scientist? At the same time, we have issues like protests about what's being taught in elementary schools, what history is being taught in elementary schools, right? This 1619 thing is like an obsession with me. I pay more attention to historians right now than I do philosophers, because I think, like Du Bois, I mean, I think that these people are sort of at the forefront of what's going on in education. What type of story are we telling about America, and how is this story being communicated? And what is my role as philosopher, who's not going to be discovering the narrower facts of the 1760s, but will have something to say about to what purpose is this story being told, and to what vision, what transformations are we trying to make in our democracy by virtue of telling the story. So it's my question here is just kind of like vague, in the sense that it's like, what is the upshot for us? A good philosopher is somebody who's like Du Bois, who pulls these things together, who has historical consciousness, who tells the truth, who has a civic engagement, who has a vision for how society ought to be, and is trying to redirect the pursuit of truth into a place where it executes this vision. And like all of that is like, it is extremely compelling. But where do we sit right now, like in a Du Boisian sense, with regard to things like 1619, COVID-19, right? How do these represent an opportunity for us, which is to say the philosophers, the people who want to have a role in the world, but who might be seen as too impractical, right? It's like, how do we grasp this moment? What's the lesson?
That question is essentially the motivation behind the chapter. And me making the argument that I make. I mean, in some ways I am concerned about how the lack of attention, as I was saying before, that philosophers give to their process of philosophizing. But maybe, and this is another point that I should emphasize in the chapter, the motivations to be philosophers sometimes concerns me with my peers. Either there isn't a clear motivation there, or it's some kind of self-indulgence, which I have no tolerance for either. Good philosophers are good civilians, right? They're concerned about the public in a dutiful way. But the other thing I was going to say, in terms of the concrete examples you were pulling out, so much about what's the debate around how knowledge is being disseminated, particularly around COVID, and the question about responsibility around historical analysis, as you were bringing up with the outrage about teaching critical race theory to third graders, which, as far as I'm concerned, I'm like, I don't know what these people are talking about.
It's not
Um,
real.
it's
Hey,
literally
look,
not
they don't
real.
even teach it in undergrad classes, dog. For real. Like you barely get exposed to it in grad school. You know what I'm
Yes.
saying?
But you know, Du
Hype.
Bois,
It's hype.
the final chapter of Black Reconstruction, Du Bois was precisely concerned with this,
Yes,
false things being
exactly.
written in history textbooks.
Mhm.
That's where that's where the concern about historical record comes from. He's primarily concerned about what American white children are being told about Reconstruction.
Yes.
That has reinvented itself essentially with the concern about critical race theory being taught to third graders. And then the final thing I'll say about something I've been thinking about more recently, which is this the Facebook whistleblower. I was listening to NPR. I've been listening to some podcasts about what's been going on with that and what is the center of the dilemma with whether or not Facebook should have sanctions put on how the newsfeed works, or if Instagram should come with some kind of warning. And it all revolves around this concern about false information being easily shared, or not just false information, socially divisive information being prioritized to be shared. And that's a kind of new version of the same problem that's driving Du Bois for us to be concerned about what it is that historians do. Only now we can be concerned about social media creators, the process in which knowledge is being disseminated and their role in that. I think that's perhaps the new thing for us to work on as philosophers. What do good philosophers do regarding social media? Yeah, so there's a lot to think about, of course.
Jeff Fry.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have to admit that when I read the title of your talk, I read it as "What Good Philosophers Do," and I heard you emphasizing what good philosophers do. And I wanted to ask you, was that double entendre intended?
No, but I'm going to take that from you now.
run with that, because I think that's kind of, looking back at it now, I think that you could use that. I mean,
yeah,
maybe.
Oh, that's a good point. Very astute. You guys have been a friendly crowd.
Oh, we're a very friendly bunch. So I don't know if Joe is still here. Jeff, do you want to talk again?
Yeah, I mean, can I just one more question?
Sure.
So I'm gonna play the devil's advocate here for a second. So maybe this won't be quite so friendly, but it's meant in a friendly way. So if someone is doing metaphysics or logic or something that doesn't seem to have any direct application, they don't want to make any direct application of what they're doing. Is that not doing philosophy, or not good philosophy?
That's a very good question. The way I set things up is I'm certainly a Hegelian in this sense. I don't think any of these things are disconnected. So I don't know that any kind of philosophical inquiry is separate from the other ones. So I'll say that at the outset. Am I suggesting that all philosophers should be public intellectuals? Definitely not. In fact, it probably would be dangerous. I mean, even myself, I wouldn't think of myself as what I do as or interested in doing is public intellectualism explicitly, right? I do the history of philosophy, right? I love scholarship. I like hanging out in libraries. That's what I want to do. But does that mean that, the question about metaphysics as a Hegelian that I'm asking myself, what kind of metaphysics Hegel is essentially designed with the system of philosophy that has no import for what's going on in the social world in our current moment. I don't think that's true. For one of my big projects right now is to show how that metaphysical system of philosophy that Hegel designs amounts to perpetual servitude for Black people and racism. right? And that clearly has a huge connection. So a lot of it has to do with the way philosophers perceive what they themselves to be doing. And that's what this project is about. I do think, as I was saying before, there needs to be more attention to that. And even where you think there are no connections, there certainly are. And if even in the scholarship, if there's no clear direct connection, which I'm doubtful of, these philosophers, if they work in universities and institutions, are teaching your children, or if you have children, or your grandchildren, or I have a niece and nephew. These people are teaching children and not just children, young adults. And for that reason too, we should be concerned about their approach to philosophizing.
Yes, well, we've been going for well more than an hour. So on that very appropriate note, I think we should give maybe a final brief round of applause for Professor Harris. Thank you so much on behalf of Muncie Public Library, Ball State University, and Ball State's Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. It's been a real pleasure to have Kimberly Ann Harris as our guest to teach us something about what good philosophers do and what good philosophers do. So
Thank you so much. It
Thank
was
you.
unbelievable. Thank you.
Thank you.
And on behalf of Muncie Public Library, I'd like to thank Dr. Harris for coming in here to give the discussion. I'd like to thank Ball State's Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies for helping us host this seminar. And for those who will be tuning in to watch this video a little bit later, please keep an eye on our calendars. Our next Big Questions, Big Ideas event should be held on November 12th, detailing pandemic sport. So we thank you very much for tuning in, and we hope everybody has a good day.